So I will start with Solitaire. I know you do the FU project, the Forgiveness Project. If you could you just tell everybody a little about that?
Yes. So greetings. I go by Solitaire, hip hop artist from Toronto. Came up during the golden era of hip hop, as they say. Um, in addition to being a producer and an artist in hip hop, part of what I've always done, I think, is a part of my calling is doing mentorship and community work and giving back, doing workshops throughout the city. Not as a part of any formal organization, but just as I felt like it's an obligation for when you reach a certain position that it's always good to try to provide some sort of mentorship and guidance for youth. That work was formalized when I joined the FU project. The F stands for Forgive You, Forgive Yourself, which is really a powerful conversation around what forgiveness could look like as a part of the healing process for people who have suffered, violence or trauma or abuse. And my formal association with FE Project was when we started the jail program at various institutions in Toronto that shall remain nameless because there's a lot of controversy around that, as you can imagine. But we remain focused on the work which is advocating for our guys in custody, gang identified youth, drug people who are in for drug offenses, violent offenders, so on and so forth. And it's been really revealing, fulfilling work to be able to go into jails and talk to young men who are incarcerated about issues like what does success look like, what is the definition of manhood, what is what are productive ways to deal with anxiety and trauma that invariably the vast majority of them have suffered but have never really truly acknowledged. So the work is fulfilling, it's gut wrenching at times, but it's important, and I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish in the 5 years that we've been doing it. So I think it's an important part of what I do in addition to being an artist.
That's great. Thank you, Solitaire. I appreciate that. Um, and I'll move on to Sidney and Rodney, who both work on the podcast Louder Than a Riot. I brushed up on a few episodes before this, but could you just go ahead and explain what you guys talk about on this podcast?
I mean, basically, it's looking at the connection between hip hop and mass incarceration, and really building out a 40 year timeline from the emergence of both, in the early '80s, and this kind of parallel growth that occurred in hip hop, and also in the prison industrial complex over the last 40 years, and just a lot of the, injustice that's built into that, and via stories, narrative stories of artists who have, been caught up in that crossfire. We kind of dive into a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, and our tagline is called The Collision of Rhyme and Punishment, because we look at how the emergence of the prison industrial complex and hip hop as the most consumed, most marketed, most profitable genre in America have really come up concurrently, and how they always intersect with each other, and how top line, the proximity and power dynamics are always at play between the both. And so, like Rodney said, we spend the season not only outlining this top line thesis, but we go into cases from the early 2000s to mid 2000s to more contemporary, like 2010s and 2020s, to show the proof of concept over and over, and how these cases and these moments of infamy when it comes to hip hop, they're not happening in a vacuum. They're part of a much larger socio-political conversation that's being had a lot of times without our benefit.
That's amazing. I think it's going to be interesting throughout this conversation to see the different context, just because Solitaire provides more of the Canadian context, being in Toronto, whereas Sidney and Rodney provide more of the American context. So I think that will be interesting throughout this conversation. Solitaire, I'll just start with a question for you. Just because you're explaining your big role in mentorship and the jail program with the FU project, what are some things that you could say that might go unseen in how mainstream rap would affect the identity of possible gang affiliated youth or youth that have spent time in incarceration? From your perspective, how does rap and the community surrounding hip hop and the lyrics affect these youth that might be incarcerated?
You know, it's a very obviously nuanced question to answer, and it involves a lot of things. You know, systemic racism. You know, in imbalance in the criminal justice system, poverty, marginalization. There's a lot of factors. You know, broken homes. But one of the things that I found when we have candid conversations about the impact of the music, it really, you know, I think a lot of times in hip hop, there is a reflexive response to the idea of how much influence the music has over the youth, particularly young men. And I think, you know, being that we grew up in Toronto, you know, in a lot of ways we're the, you know, the little brother of hip hop coming from New York. We pretty much were studying the game. I think in a lot of ways it served as a social experiment about the influence that hip hop has for young men who don't necessarily have male role models in their life. And I have personally, I can only speak to conversations that I've had with young men and can reflect on the things that they've said to me. And a lot of their identity, you know, growing up, especially like the younger generation from us, you know, they really are influenced by what is personified as success, what is personified as how a man is supposed to behave in relation to women, in relation to education, in relation to, you know, entrepreneurship. There's a huge impact that the music and influence has that I think is it's difficult for hip hop to be accountable for, because, you know, part of the conversation that we have is this idea of, you know, role models and, you know, whether or not artists or athletes are role models. And one of the things that I've kind of realized as an artist who's kind of achieved a sort of like level of fame and being, you know, people know who I am and listen to my music, is that it doesn't matter whether or not, you know, I agree that being a role model is a choice. And you hear a lot of artists who say, you know, it's not my responsibility to raise your kids. And, you know, I'm talking my truths and about my music, which I 100% agree with. But at the end of the day, I think the choice is of whether or not you accept the responsibility is one thing, but the fact of the matter is the influence is real, and you see it in the choices that a lot of these young men make, as far as like their perception of women in hip hop, their perception of, you know, being a hustler or being strong. You know, a lot of these things, with the lack of a solid male role model in their life, comes from the culture, because they have no other place to turn to other than, you know, what they see outside their window, which is poverty and not a lot of opportunity. So, you know, on the one hand, where you can't place the responsibility of hip hop, responsibility of society's ills that affect the Black and brown and marginalized community, you can't place it on hip hop. It does play a role in perpetuating a lot of the stereotypes that exist within it. And I think, you know, on the one hand, while it's important for us to fight against the injustices within the system, I think it's now more than ever, it's crucial that we also, you know, having the knowledge that we have available to us, we also have to recognize the accountability that we have as artists in perpetuating a lot of the negative stereotypes that exist. And that is really personified by, not all is, you know, I don't want to generalize because everybody has their own story, but the narratives that I've heard from a lot of the young men that we work with, some have actually come out right and said hip hop ruined my life, you know, which was quite shocking to me because there's not a lot of not a lot of people that would cop to something like that. But the influence is real, and I think that we have to accept the role that it plays.
Yeah, for sure. I think very important terms you used as in accountability, role models, influence, especially for the youth. Just to remind you guys, this is an open discussion. Sidney, Rodney, did you want to weigh in at all? Because as Solitaire was talking, I feel like you guys were agreeing with some of what he was saying.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think, well,
Yeah.
the first thing I would say is I've never heard someone say hip hop ruined my life. I hear people more so often say hip hop saved my life. So that's like a revelation for me. But I would definitely say that intent does not always equal impact. And I think that's what you're talking about, Solitaire, and how one person speaking their truth and then being raised to a level of popularity or prominence in a celebrity driven intrinsically misogynistic culture, it's not like you can wash your hands of it once you put it out. So yeah, we've seen that happen a lot, and that's one of the things that we try to interrogate and examine in our show. Like, where is the onus when these things start to cripple and maim and inject like intergenerational trauma on the Black community. Like, hip hop was conceived to be our voice when we didn't have a voice, right? Like, it was the language of the oppressed. That's kind of what we say with calling the show Louder Than a Riot. I'll let Rodney speak to the origin of the name a little bit more, but it's like, if riot is the language of the unheard, like, hip hop is the soundtrack. Because I'll just say, in America, hip hop always reminds us that this country was not conceived or incorporated or made profitable for the benefit of Black people. It was all those things on the backs of Black people. So hip hop is literally like our outlet for catharsis and expression and joy and pain. But when those things go out into the world and then they become so popular, I think there is definitely a sense of responsibility that needs to be taken upon artists, upon A&Rs, upon marketing departments, upon DJs, but also upon the people who are widely and discriminately policing communities of color. That's even keep people their storylines and giving them the world they see that they need to talk about, they need to rap about.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to remember that a lot of the stuff that we hear being perpetuated through the music is a direct result of a lot of the structural violence and cultural violence that, you know, has impacted these artists in the communities that they've grown up in. So you know, definitely not to take away, you know, the accountability and responsibility that each individual and artist has. I think in a lot of ways, you know, that they're a reflection of the reality that they have lived and been exposed to. And you know, like Sidney's saying, once that is commodified by an industry, it begins to replicate itself, you know, due to market forces that
On
are
autopilot.
beyond our control, you know, and artists begin to mimic what they see as successful or popular, or, you know, what is deemed as a success, you know, and that ends up being your motive to become an artist more than the art itself. So yeah, I think it's a lot of like systemic and cyclical issues that kind of account for a lot of that stuff.
For sure, for sure. Um, just because you two mentioned Louder Than the Riot again, I wanted to explore a conspiracy theory that you guys brought up on your podcast. It suggested that the music industry and the prison system joined together to make money by increasing the prison population and leveraging some of the criminal elements embedded in hip hop and hip hop culture. Without giving away the whole podcast, because I want our audience to listen, what were the central questions of this conspiracy theory or of these ideas?
Yeah, well, this is a conspiracy theory that started circulating around the internet, you know, maybe about I don't know, was that around 2012 or so? And it, like you say, it suggested that that the music was purposely being enlisted to market and promote and capitalize on, you know, a lot of the stereotypes and the kind of stuff that would promote violent behavior. And you know, the idea was that then that would help feed the private prison industry, and that everyone could invest in that industry and make money as a result. Um, in some ways, I think that we felt like it was an interesting way to kind of lead into the exploration of some of these bigger issues. So, you know, it wasn't really something that we kind of put out there to validate or you know, to test the veracity of the claim itself or the theory itself, but more so just to say, hey, the fact that this kind of paranoia exists about the state of mass incarceration and its impact and its disproportionate impact on our communities is enough to look into this issue. And I think it allowed us just to really get deep and explore some things that I think in a lot of ways we didn't even expect to find as we looked at specific cases of specific artists who really kind of, you know, personify or, you know, exemplify a lot of the stuff, a lot of these issues that we're talking about.
The conspiracy theory, and we say really early with the caveat, like, we're not trying to prove this conspiracy theory, we're not saying it's real, because, you know, especially in the time of fake news, like, that's not what time we're on. But it had to do a lot with the like a secret meeting, an alleged secret meeting, where the record execs of all the top companies met with proprietors of America's prisons, the prison industrial complex, as they were building them up. And they made that agreement that if, like, you start to promote more music that highlights and glamorizes and galvanizes criminal activity, like, it's gonna fill our prison cells, and then in turn we can fill your pockets. Like, you'll get it. You know, it's one of those scratch back, scratch yours. And I think as we're going through that, as we're going through telling that story, and then we have people who come in and talk to us about what was happening in the 80s, both in hip hop and in the prison industrial complex, and then in the 90s, and then at the turn of the century, the new millennium, you see that, first of all, conspiracies in hip hop, just as conspiracies in, like, Black culture, are always going to be, like, always going to have a stronghold on the culture, because so much was kept from us in the first place, right? We have, sorry, I live in New York, there's someone blasting music. We have people who talk about how, yeah, I mean, the Tuskegee experiment was a conspiracy, right? People following and profiling Billie Holiday, that was a conspiracy theory, right? Like, all these things are conspiracy theories until they're proven to be fact years later, and then you can have that revisionist history on it way after that those people are, you know, dead and gone. And we have someone, I won't give away the whole thing, but we have someone make the conclusion that it's like, yeah, you can tell me that's a conspiracy theory, but it's not a conspiracy theory that if you live in a poor Black neighborhood where the graduation rate of the local high school is only 30%, like, the probability of he or she starting to get into the drug game instead of graduating goes up, like, by 60%. It's not a conspiracy theory that more than 95% of criminal cases in the US end in a plea deal, and they bog you down with charges rather than take you to trial to try and prove your innocence. It's not a conspiracy theory that you can maintain your innocence about a crime you say you didn't commit for decades long, and then be offered and then new evidence come out in support of that after you maintaining your innocence for years and years. And then the best a government will offer you is like an early parole or time allotted towards it, and not full exoneration. Like, there's so many things set up in the criminal industrial complex, and even in the talks about reform, that feed into victimization of Black people. And those are not conspiracies. Those are real. We got stats for that. And you know what? Hip hop has been the socio-political reporters on the streets, even before there were stats to back it up, and even before people wanted to believe it. So I think as we go through the season, we draw out that through line more and more, and you see a lot of things about the power dynamics of the music industry, the power dynamics of the prison industrial complex, the power dynamics that are rooted in the rap game as a culture. And the more you listen to it and the more we go through the years, it just becomes self-evident, right? We find these truths to be self-evident.
I think it's very important, and I think this can kind of segue into what I did want to talk about next, is how rap can lead to the police kind of the over incarceration of Black men. I think, Solitaire, I want you to speak about this because you are an OG rapper in Toronto, and I want to get your thoughts on the ideas by this law professor, who was exploring to what extent that rappers could be convicted or targeted because of the lyrics and what they rap about in their lyrics, and whether that is admissible in court or in the court of justice, or if it could be used against them. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, hip hop is you know, it's one of the most profound influences in music, and it's interesting as far as like, we're not as obviously as deep in terms of like the hip hop police as somewhere like New York or what have you. But that is to say that, you know, there's rappers dry snitch on themselves all the time on social media. It's like an epidemic up here. And there's this idea of, you know, when we have these conversations in jail, this idea of, I'm real. You can only rap about this life because if you've actually lived it. And then on the flip side, it becomes, this is just entertainment. You know what I mean? And what I'm saying is not real. It's like, it's real for my perception in the streets, but then when it comes to whether or not they're going to hold me accountable for my lyrics in court, then it becomes entertainment. And we've always kind of ridden this juxtaposition because, you know, we're artists and, you know, wordplay, and obviously for me it is entertainment. You know what I mean? You're taking your real life experiences and you're flipping it like a comedian tells his jokes. It doesn't mean that it's actually true, but he's using it to kind of make a point through his music. As far as whether or not it's admissible in court, that is a very difficult thing to say. There's, you know, looking at it from the perspective of the fact that there's, you know, Black and brown communities are far more over policed than other communities who are guilty of the same crimes at a lot of times. There's that aspect of it. But the reality is a lot of the artists that are, you know, especially in Toronto right now, which is, you know, really breaks my heart, is, you know, a lot of them are really involved in a lot of this back and forth stuff. And they're incriminating themselves out of this idea of proving just how, you know, proving that they're a demon, proving that, you know, we run the streets. Those guys don't run the streets. We sweep the block from these guys. You know what I mean? So it's hard to kind of like try to pinpoint what's the right approach, because, you know, a lot of what these guys, as far as like hip hop artists are living in that lifestyle, is very real. And that's based on the experiences that I had with some of the young men that we mentor. But should that define who they are outside of the music? Absolutely not. Should that lead to them being, you know, relieved of their freedom? Absolutely not. There's a more of a discussion, more of an encompassing, nuanced discussion to have around that. But, you know, it's definitely a problematic situation.
And I know, as I think it happened last year, where Toronto rapper Houdini was shot on the street, right? And the Toronto Sun did an article saying who made Houdini vanish. So I think the way that the press deals with it too, it just shows the ways that they value these rappers and these Black.
Well, yeah, that is just straight up racism in the media. I think, you know, the perception of hip hop media, like from the media here in Canada, I'm sure, you know, it's the same in the US. It's just not, it's not taken seriously. It's not validated. They're not treated as human beings. They're basically treated as numbers. You know what I mean? Like, and the fact that they could put a picture of this young man who was murdered and, you know, try to be tongue in cheek with a cute headline just goes to show, you know, how a lot of the, you know, Black and brown youth in our communities are dehumanized. You know, these are tragic situations. There's guys getting murdered. It's a problem. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of layers to, you know, what feeds that problem. But a big part of it is the fact that they're not looked at as human. They're looked at as expendable. Oh, he probably did something to deserve it. You know, but the media, like I remember that we were really wrestling that when we had that discussion, because we talked about it in jail, and there was no surprise. They're like, yeah, we're not surprised that they would say something like that. It's kind of that feeling of like you have no voice in that fight, in that discussion.
Yeah, that's disgusting. I want to just, first of all, like, that's horrible that was the headline. I didn't even see that, but I want to bolster something Solitaire said about how at the core is racist, and people don't call that out enough. The fact that hip hop is the only genre that gets lyrics brought into the courtroom and used to vilify and convict people, like, that's racist. It has racist implications, and that's just is dangerous. Because if you look at any other genre, we were talking the other day, me and Rodney, about Billie Eilish. Billie Eilish has one of her like building blocks is like shock value in her music videos. And one of her early songs was talking about like throwing somebody in a trunk because she killed her friend, blah blah blah. Billie Eilish would never have to answer for that in a courtroom, right? But as soon as an artist is implicated in any type of crime, their lyrics are allowed to be brought in to talk about their character or anyone's motive or their intent to commit a crime, or that the lyrics themselves are a crime. When again, like, one of the building blocks of America is supposed to be freedom of speech, but that's truly a luxury. It's not a right, and you can tell that when these things happen, and then these things continue to happen, and it's a trend that is allowed to continue. Like, we covered this a few times in the course of our season with the case of Mac Phipps, who's a New Orleans rapper. And he was signed to No Limit. And at the time, he was like really coming up. He was supposed to be one of their next up on their roster. And he was caught up in a crime at a nightclub shooting, and they used his lyrics in the courtroom, and they used it to convict him. And he's still in prison to this day. Sorry, you hear that? Sorry. No, but it's like, it's insidious, it's egregious, and it's dangerous because it's allowed to keep happening.
I was just going to mention, and Rodney, if you can touch upon this, I know a more recent example, as you guys did a 3-part series on your podcast about Bobby Shmurda, who was released not too long ago. From my knowledge, I think part of his conviction, they did use his lyrics kind of against him, right? I think you guys touched upon that briefly.
Well, they didn't actually sorry, go ahead, Rodney.
No, go ahead.
They didn't technically use his lyrics against him because he got a plea deal. It never went to court, and it was never a criminal trial. Other members in GS9 did go to trial because they said no to the plea deal, and they ended up doing it's like 68 and 97 years for a crime. But I think what's the insidious part about Bobby Shmurda's case is the gang conspiracy laws, which, Rodney, I'll let you talk about.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically, you know, a lot of these conspiracy laws, especially the way they're being used now in New York, these are laws kind of like the RICO laws that were basically created to take down criminal organized crime syndicates, right? The mob. And now they're being used and deployed against really young street crews that are nowhere near as organized as the mob. And they're young, and a lot of times, because of the way these conspiracy laws work, it allows everyone to be charged with, the worst crime that one or a few members of a street crew have committed. So you saw that deployed in Bobby Shmurda's case, in terms of, there being murder charges that they were able to dangle in front of everybody in that crew, although only a couple of them were truly implicated in the crime. And they used, those really harsh charges to push them toward a plea deal. And then by the time the plea deal was struck, they pulled back the murder charge because that wasn't really something that they were going to intend on pursuing in terms of getting a conviction, because most likely they didn't have the evidence for everybody on that. But, by that point, you've already kind of, cornered somebody or beat somebody down into thinking that, their best choice is to take a plea deal on lesser charges. So, the way these kind of laws or these kind of tactics are being deployed in investigations and by prosecutors, again, it's something that's increasingly happening to young crews of Black and brown men. I mean, to go back further, the DJ Drama case, the mixtape case, those were RICO charges that he got hit with. They said it was criminal conspiracy, and he was trafficking in mixtapes, distribution, he had a network and it was criminal activity. Now he ended up not being convicted for that. He spent a night in jail and the charges ended up being dropped, but we know what kind of damage it did to him in that moment, and we obviously know what kind of damage it did to mixtapes as a cultural product and a cottage industry at that time. I mean, they went on to live in name and on as digital product, but that hand-to-hand physical distribution of mixtapes really never came back after that. And the culture, as is so often required to do, was forced to adapt and change in order to continue to survive. So these are just some of the ways that the culture is policed and in ways that aren't happening outside of our culture, outside of Black and brown folk.
I think it's definitely important to look into the resources and the ways that these young men who are seeing maybe their first encounter with the criminal justice system and maybe not knowing their options. Solitaire, with the jail program you do with the Forgiveness Project, do you find that the young people who might be incarcerated know about their options or have resources that educate them on their options?
No. Short and long answer. These are guys who are coming from circumstances where they're day to day in their lives. They don't have a lot of support from their families. There's not really a whole lot of resources in the communities. And when it comes to like legal representation that actually takes into account not just the charges that they're facing, but their entire life of lived experience leading up to that, and offering them some guidance and some perspective is very, very, very rare. So a lot of these guys are basically in the system on their own, left to fend for themselves. So there's not a lot of advocating happening or a lot of guidance, and that's part of that's one of the gaps that we try to fill. We're not an organization that specializes in the legal aspect of, helping these guys fight their charges or deal with rehabilitation, but we try to affiliate and connect the dots as far as within our network of, community organizations that do help to administer some guidance for these guys, but there's definitely not a lot of that happening.
Agreed. After all these issues that you guys brought up, I just want to elevate to the topic of change and what needs to be changed. And I also want, I want you guys to touch upon, to what extent might hip hop artists need to change the ways that they navigate within the industry or to the youth. I know we touched upon being role models to a certain extent, but yeah, if you guys can share about what you think about change and what needs to change with all of this.
That's a tough question to answer, because I mean, at the end of the day, artists have autonomy over what they want to rap about. Like that's at the foundation of the culture of hip hop. It's, you know, taking something from nothing. So I, as an artist, will never, you know, look down upon anybody who's trying to make something of themselves through their art, and you know, taking a negative and turning it into a positive. But for me, you know, even just reflecting back on this idea, you know, Sid, when you were shocked, like as I was, when that young man talked about how hip hop had ruined his life, I think where he was coming from is the idea of, he obviously was somebody who didn't have a lot of role models in his life, and he turned to the music. Like he didn't have a father, he didn't have, like he was basically somebody who expressed to me, you know, he looked out his window, what did he see? He saw hustlers, he saw pimps, he saw poverty, and that was, you know, his opportunity for escape. And a lot of that was fueled by the soundtrack of hip hop. And he looked to it for an identity that he created, and it kind of, you know, drew him into this lifestyle. Is that hip hop's fault? No, like everybody is responsible for their individual choices. But I think, you know, when I turn it on its ear, I think that it's not about asking artists to be perfect or change their messaging, but it's, you know, like one of my favorite hip hop artists from my generation, Jay-Z, I feel like more artists need to give perspective. I think if there's a distinction between the golden era of hip hop and the hip hop that's dominant now, is I think there was a lot more diversity in the messaging in the music. There was a lot more opportunity for gangster rap, like like NWA, but then you also had somebody like Ice Cube, who was gangster, but he was also highly intellectual in terms of like how he deconstructed the issues that Black people face in America. You know, there was a lot more opportunity for Black empowerment rap to be successful, whereas nowadays there's not really a whole lot of space for that, because it's become, you know, the capitalism force on how to be successful, like the blueprint for being successful as an artist, has completely shifted to, you know, I own a recording studio, and I have artists who have literally come to the studio and say, I'm not trying to rap, bro. Like, people don't give a fuck about rapping anymore. They just want to, it's like a vibe, you know what I mean? And I think it's one of those things where the art form itself is not responsible for it, but the industry, you know, whether or not that conspiracy theory about the letter is true, it's just, you know, which I don't think it is, by the way. I think that it's just a victim of capitalism, and this idea of, you know, if that's what sells, then that's what we're going to sell. And we're going to sign it, and we're going to sell it because that's where the money is, as opposed to labels that actually care about curating the culture. So I think ownership of, you know, more Black ownership of our music, and being willing to understand the power of the impact that we have through the messages in our music. Not to say that you have to change it or like necessarily be a quote unquote positive rapper. I don't think that's the answer either, because that's unrealistic. Life is not positive. You know, life is real. Some people are going through some terrible circumstances. And I think that it's important to have music that is a release that speaks to that and highlights those struggles. But I think perspective is one thing, rather than, you know, I think a lot of these guys are drawn to the escapism of the music, rather than, you know, when we were coming up, there's a lot more of a, you know, a Black power, Black empowerment movement that I feel like, I don't know if it's being silenced, but it's definitely not at the forefront, or it doesn't have the space to exist as much as it did back in those times. There's a lot of factors for that as well, but.
Sidney, Rodney, feel free to weigh in if you'd like.
Now, well said. I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, I do think that, you know, market forces, you know, like I said before, have narrowed the playing field, you know, in so many ways, and the channels and the consolidation of, you know, radio that happened, what, 20, 30 years ago, and where, you know, local DJs don't program radio stations, you know, one corporate office programs, you know, hundreds of stations across the country and whatnot. You know, there's so many factors. You know, the consolidation that happened on radio was happening with the labels, where, you know, all of a sudden we only had a handful of major labels. And you know, the labels also own the cable stations where the videos play. And so all of a sudden you just see this condensation and this shrinking of what is considered viable music. I mean, it's one, I think, I don't remember if we asked this in an episode or not, but I think one of the questions that came up for us in some ways, kind of like what Solitaire is talking about, is like, you know, can you imagine like what hip hop may sound like now, if the market changes, and the capitalism and the commodification of it that starts to happen in the early 90s, as gangster rap explodes, right? As Dre and Snoop become, you know, some of the top selling artists, and, you know, 70% white fans are all of a sudden consuming these really kind of like stereotypical images of Black folks. Like, what might the music sound like if it was still driven by cultural forces that come out of our communities, rather than, you know, market forces that that come out of other communities? You know what I mean? I think we have to just think about all of that, because I do think it becomes easy to wonder why artists themselves are kind of stuck in this, you know, in this blender, you know, making the same kind of music. But I always just try to look at the bigger picture of like, what is it that's driving them to make these kind of choices? And, you know, I just wish that there was a way for us to start to hold the industry more accountable. I mean, I think we saw a lot of interest and movement around that last year, obviously, with the industry blackout and all that kind of stuff. Definitely a lot of good conversation. But man, like, you know, the industry has been, you know, robbing and pillaging Black artists for so many decades, you know, over a century. Like, there's just a lot of historic stuff to work through in terms of, you know, how the industry treats Black artists and Black art. And I think that a lot of that just has to be dealt with. Like, why is it legal? Why is it legal that, you know, some of these contracts and how much money, you know, artists make versus how much money, you know, the industry, the labels make? I mean, if we saw imbalances like that fixed, you could be the kind of rapper that you want to be and see the kind of bottom line that you need to exist, without saying, oh man, if I want to make money or have a career, I got to do what sells and I got to do this kind of rap. So like, all of that stuff is like stuff that really has to be dealt with, you know?
I think in terms of like the bigger picture of hip hop's ecosystem right now, though, I would say there is more variety and choice and autonomy than there ever has been, because you definitely have those crazy powerful label pressures who have a chokehold on a lot of the conversation and a lot of the sound of the industry. That's very true. But on the other side of that coin, you have artists of every economic status, in every country, in every city, at least in every city in America, making stuff literally with like bare bones and their computer screens. And I think there is a lot more power in the artist's hands now than we realize. I think about artists like Tierra Whack or No Name or Tyler the Creator or even Lil Baby, like with his song Bigger Picture. I think there's more, especially in the last like 10 to 5 years, there's been a bigger push on the artist end of showing like, yo, I'm multifaceted. I am not a caricature of what a rapper is. This is not some like new age minstrelsy who's like riding a wave of a vibe. Like, I think the ones who are really raising the top and the ones who are going to leave a legacy behind are the people who are taking more creative control of their music, even if they have a label trying to push them to put out a few albums a year. Like, even thinking back to, what was it, 2016, like Chance the Rapper, he had the whole industry scared because he was like, I'm putting out music for free, I'm selling it all for free, I don't like the structure and the model and the monetization of Black art in this way. I'm a tour all year, and that's how I'm gonna make my bread, and I'm gonna flip it and keep making music for free. And he had such a tidal wave of influence in the industry that in less than like 3 years of him dropping his first tape, the recording industry of America, the people who are responsible for the Grammys, they changed the rules to allow like streaming only albums as part of something that, as a part of like the eligibility to get a Grammy. And that man got a Grammy off a mixtape. Like, I know he loves to say the superlative in hip hop, but like, it's true. Like, that's one of those moments, looking back on the history of hip hop, the people who rise to the top and who become historic are the ones who are not afraid to put their neck out and be that change. Like, and that's why, I mean, I think so many people love the broad strokes of hip hop history now, but there's a lot of duds there that people don't talk about. Like, that, I'm not gonna say no names, but you know, like there's a lot of like D-list people who had a hit and had a vibe for like a couple weeks, but don't stand the test of time. And I think that speaks to, and the people who do, I think speaks to the cultural capital of hip hop as it's always been and as it will continue to be.
For sure.
Just a quick anecdote of some of the things that I'll never forget this conversation I had with this she's a white woman, that she's a peer, she's a writer, and it's a kind of like just an anecdote of what we're up against, because you know, when it comes to like the free market forces, it's like ultimately what drives what becomes popular is because of what people want to listen to. And I think that, you know, there is this perception of what, you know, the mainstream, how they like to see their black people. You know what I'm saying? Like there is a degree of fetishization of Black culture. You know, the hyper masculine, alpha male, super thug that doesn't take no shit and like can't, you know what I mean? Like, so there's that perception. And I remember we were having, I can't remember who the artist was, but we were talking about somebody who was not a thug. And I remember she's like, yeah, I don't want to hear that positive shit. I like to hear that thug shit. I don't care about hearing that positive shit. And I'm like, you know, there's a lot more to Black culture than just that thug shit. The fact that it's so easy for her to dismiss that as a part of the culture of hip hop is kind of, you know, I mean, it's just an anecdote, of course, but I think a lot of that drives what, you know, where artists try to channel their energy, because it becomes about being successful, making money, rather than, you know, speaking through your art. I think there is to Sid's point, I do agree. That's one thing I always represent, is I think that there is a balance ultimately in the artists themselves, in the artist community. I think there is a lot of diversity as far as like, you know, identities, but when it becomes a matter of like how do you turn that into like mainstream success, that's where you start to see, you know, the funnel effect of like, well, you got to kind of hit these check marks in order to be successful. Yeah. So it's kind of like you got to steer away. One of the conversations I have is steering away from celebrity culture, idolizing, you know, what does it mean to be successful? I remember as an artist growing up, my idea of, you know, I want to be a superstar rapper, have all the girls in the fancy cars, but if I'm able to make a living and I don't have to work in an office, that's a successful artist to me. And, you know, like there's artists like Tech Nine who's never had a record played on mainstream radio ever, but he's had an entire career and made more money than probably most of the rappers.
Because he owns all his stuff. Yep.
Because he owns all of his stuff. And it's like, he had his niche. He didn't really care about being on MTV or having that profile. Right. He really maintained the integrity of his music. And I think if more artists, now is the time to do that, to really maintain control and ownership of your own music without chasing mainstream success.
Mm-hmm. One thing that is not talked about enough, I think, is the white gaze and how it's infiltrated hip hop.
Yes.
And like when we talk about these big label head meetings, you know, and purported, you know, conspiracy theory meeting, like it's the higher you go up in the C-suites of a lot of these major labels, nobody melanated is at the table making a decision about the culture and where the culture is going and who is allowed to have a voice in it. And that's part of like the like what needs to be fixed on like a base level. Mm-hmm. I started talking more about how the revolution has been monetized, because people's metric of success, when it is like, let's say, if it's more of like a caricature point of view, it's like having all the girls, having all the cars, it's just like being able to prove you're the most masculine man in the whole 150-foot radius, right? And that, like, interrogating that, really self-interrogating that, it you see like where the onus lies. Yes, it lies on you, but it also lies on a lot of things we talk about in the show, which is like structural violence, cultural violence that trickles down to moments of direct violence and like self-hate in the Black community and perpetuation of a lot of the things that people, you know, like turn their nose up or want to lean forward in on hip hop. And I feel like that's something that goes back to Black men being emasculated, and capitalism driving everything that we do. Like, it's so funny. In one of our later episodes in the series, we talk about where we're at now, present day, with so many hip hop figureheads and rappers themselves being leaders in the reform movement, right? And talking about reform America's prisons. But as we dig deeper into that topic, we really had to start investigating. It's like, why are we reforming something that's never been tenable for us and for our benefit in the first place? Like, why are we trying to make, you know, this monster of a folkway and culture like a little bit more safer for us, when it's never been proven to be safe in the first place, right? Like, those things are untenable. We talked to a lot of abolitionists, and I'll say no name again because she is one of the people who is definitely still considered more on like hip hop's counterculture and fringe, because she doesn't have, like, let's say, a song on the radio. She doesn't have a major like crossover, major label deal, but she is steadfast in like being about what she raps about, what she reads about, what she learns about, and sharing that every step of the way. And like, one of her, you know, most recent platforms has really been about abolishing prisons in America, abolishing oppression of Black people globally. And I think those are the things that we need to highlight more, to signal boost more, and to not to like celebrity culture drool over and idolize, but consider as those wave making moments and wave makers in hip hop, rather than people who are throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at a problem that is not going to be solved with us in mind in the first place.
For sure. Those are some great ideas. You three shared some great things, especially me being a criminology student, and many of my crim classes, we miss out on the socio-political perspective of things, which you three obviously provide in great detail. And I just wish that not sending shots to my school or props or anything, but I wish that there were more courses where we can learn things like the things that you guys are sharing, because I think it's extremely important. I do want to leave time for Q&A. I'm sure people have questions. So I'm just gonna signal over to the Q&A. I'm not sure if people are messaging them in the chat. Marco or Zoe?
I'm seeing some comments here. I haven't seen any questions, but some comments.
Are we doing the questions in the just in the chat? Well, if anybody has any questions, you can type it out in the chat. I could read them out.
Randy, so I don't actually see questions just yet, but there are some comments if you want to share those, or if you've got your own questions, just to give people a chance to.
For sure. I'll just read this comment here. It says, thanks so much. Learned so much. It's from Tanya. Sorry if I butchered your name. I love the cultural layers, expanse, and all the narrations you all gave about what's going on and what hip hop means and can mean. Thank you. Amy put a question here. Any ideas for how to incorporate this within the classroom? Which is a question that I would have too, like social studies or English. So yeah, Amy asked, are there any ideas of how students can learn this, how we can incorporate this in our classrooms?
You know, I've in my experience, it has to come from a place of actually being invested in caring about the culture and knowledgeable about its history and about the community that is impacted by social justice imbalances. There's so many examples of ways that it can be incorporated, but it really is a matter of how much does the government care? How much do the people in power in these positions in the educational institutions, how much do they care about having meaningful conversations about the impact of hip hop and the power of hip hop? Is not, I mean, specifically, it really is a understanding like the historical context of where the music comes from, taking literally, creating something from nothing. And being imported to New York, and it's got to come from a place of profound respect and appreciation for the culture. And I think once you start from there, there's so many different ways that it can be incorporated. I mean, I know there's universities in the States that already have like university level courses on hip hop and its influences. But as far as like how you can implement it in school, it's like there's a lot of artists that you can bring in, like myself, who can actually curate conversations about how it can be used for positive change in the communities that we service and advocate for.
Yeah, there are just piggybacking on that, there are a lot of artists here on this side that are doing just that, with universities. Ninth Wonder is taught at Duke University, North Carolina Central. Bun B taught a class at Rice University. I'm not remembering other hip hop artists specifically right now, but I know I'm leaving out a lot. And then obviously, hip hop in the academy is kind of like the final frontier right now for the culture. So many hip hop professors that are really teaching this stuff in ways that we're just barely scratching the surface on, that are really super in depth and knowledgeable and do it in a way where the culture is both critiqued but also used as a way to dig at and scratch out a lot of the socio-political issues that we're talking about that just kind of like undergird all of this stuff. So, it's a really ripe area right now.
Jasleen, I see your questions in the chat. I see a couple of questions in the chat. I'm just because Bradley raised his hand. Bradley, you can unmute if you'd like.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Of course.
Really quick question. Hopefully it's a quick question, make room, but I'm really curious to think or ask you what you feel about the hip hop community, in a sense, trying to act as almost like a meta where high profile rap artists were imprisoned. I always think about like the Free Weezy t-shirts, and the Free Meek Mill. And what do you feel is the impact that the hip hop community has had publicly about trying to push or engage social justice reform and Do you think it's made an impact or is having an impact in your opinion?
Yeah, well, Sid was kind of touching on that in terms of, you know, Jay-Z's reform initiatives, you know, in conjunction with Meek Mill. And, you know, Van Jones was formerly the CEO of their reform organization. They've pushed for a lot of substantial reforms on the legislative side, and you know, they've funded and are funding a lot of judicial cases. You know, there's a Parchment Prison case, which is, you know, one of the old prisons in Mississippi that, you know, used to be a slave plantation back in the day. They've been really forceful on that side, and we explore that in our last episode of the season, actually, where we also kind of explore how, which is what Sid was talking about, how in a lot of ways there's a strong critique that in a lot of ways pushing for reforms of the prison industrial complex only further entrench the prison industrial complex, which is, you know, what has kind of helped to popularize the idea of abolition. I mean, there are people that can speak to this stuff a whole lot better than I can, but Miriam Kaba is someone that we also talked to in that same episode. I mean, we got Van Jones and Miriam Kaba in the same episode. It's like you couldn't get more extreme. But you know, they talked a lot about just the ideas that are kind of fueling, you know, this mainstreaming of this conversation around reform and abolition. I mean, around abolition, which, you know, you don't hear quite as much in terms of hip hop being involved, but other than, like Sidney said, No Name being a really huge proponent. So I think that it runs the gamut. You know, hip hop is talking about it a little bit, is being about it in other cases, like, you know, Jay-Z and Meek Mill, and then is being about it to a whole other level, in terms of trying to challenge and change the mindset when you think about people like No Name. So obviously Black Lives Matter and a lot of stuff that happened last year is really kind of popularized the conversation around that kind of stuff, more so than anything. And I think in a lot of ways, you know, artists are listening and learning like the rest of us, you know, while activists and organizers take the lead on that kind of stuff, as it should be, you know.
Thanks so much, Rodney. And thanks, Bradley, for the question. I'm just gonna signal over to Jaslene's question in the chat. I was wondering if you could talk about the role that humor and or satire plays in hip hop. Earlier, Solitaire compared hip hop artists to stand-up comedians, and I'd love to hear more. Thanks so much to all our wonderful, impactful speakers today.
Is that in the, let me just read that, make sure I got it right. Oh, I mean, humor and satire is funny. You know, one of my favorite hip hop artists is Ghostface. And I remember I was reading an article and he was like, you know, a lot of what I rap about is actually like, it's supposed to be funny. And I was like, I was actually kind of like thrown by that, but I think it plays a huge role. Satire, humor, you know, being able to make the best of a very dark situation. It's a part of the storytelling nature of the culture. And I think it's, you know, using analogies to highlight, you know, different themes and stories about, you know, what's happening in our communities is an important aspect. I think just like, you know, the brilliance of somebody like Dave Chappelle being able to tell a story that, you know, he makes it sound like it's actually something that he went through, but he's probably in a lot of ways just paraphrasing in order to make a point. And I think that that's, you know, a big part of what hip hop does. Even like when rappers are talking about, you know, how many people they shot, you know, probably they haven't shot anybody. 99%, they probably haven't shot anybody, but it's more so the narrative that they're trying to, you know, it's the wordplay of the music, but it's also fueled by a lot of what I think are some of the negative energies that inspire that is because of the perception is what they're after, as far as like how they want people to perceive them. So I think they're crucial to being able to talk about some of the really difficult, tough subject matter in the music, to kind of to make it relatable in a way, to make it to understand, to try to communicate the plight of the communities that a lot of these guys are from.
Absolutely. I think in every era, like satire was clearly like something in the arsenal of artists. And even comedians, they get sampled and used in like interludes, because it's it's all part of the same, it's all part of the same culture. I think about like how Richard Pryor got sampled in 2 Live Crew albums, or Slick Rick's bedtime stories, or ODB, or Ghostface, or the late great MF Doom. Up to now, people like Chance, people like Tierra Whack, people like Tyler the Creator and Domo Genesis. It's always been there, because it's like I said earlier, it's part of the catharsis of making the music. It's the outlet when you don't have any other outlet. So all those emotions and those comedic moments come through.
That even makes me think about, I was rewatching Friday today, and I was thinking about so many songs sampled so many of Chris Tucker's lines. And you brought up Chance, and I know in Ultralight Beam they sampled the little girl preaching in the beginning of the song. I know they sampled that too. But yeah, moving on to the next question in the chat by Dega. Again, sorry if I mispronounce your name. Sidney, Rodney, I know actually all three of you touched upon this a lot, but hip hop is now the most consumed genre in terms of GP approval. How do you think hip hop has changed in recent decades? It seems that the genre is only growing, with Kendrick winning a Peabody and Jay-Z entering the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
What was the GP thing you said?
So hip hop is now the most consumed genre in terms of GP approval. How do you think
general
hip-hop
public? Okay.
Yeah, I guess so. How do you think hip hop has changed in the recent decades?
I mean, I think it's changing all the time. I do think that, a lot of this these mainstream institutions, and this Pulitzer, I think they meant Pulitzer, not Peabody, for Kendrick. But a lot of these mainstream institutions, it's bandwagoning. I mean, straight up, they are so late. And I think they finally woke up one day and realized, we're gonna be irrelevant if we don't embrace, the present. You know what I mean? It's not the future. It's the present and the past at this point. I mean, they're so late on acknowledging, what the kind of cultural and political, not political, but well, political too, but pop culture force that hip hop has been for so many decades now, that I think they're finally kind of realizing that that's the only way that they can maintain some sense of relevancy. So I don't really look to those kind of things to as a scale or a way to measure hip hop's success or growth or any of that kind of stuff, because we've been driving the culture and at the forefront of the culture for so long that anybody else has been playing catch up with us. And I really I think that our barometers have to be not the Grammy Awards and stuff like that, but they have to be the artistry, and how is the artistry changing, or how is it staying the same, how is it stagnating? I think the best critics of hip hop culture and the best measures of it is the culture itself. I mean, I think that hip hop is one of the few genres that is constantly self-critiquing, and I don't mean the industry, I mean like people that are really of the culture. Social media has obviously helped with that kind of stuff. So I think basically what I'm saying is I think that those should be our guideposts, is us, not these institutions that, have finally decided to laud us or give us our roses or whatever. We have to make sure that we're looking on us in terms of determining how is, and I know I haven't even spoken to how it's changed. I mean, I'll let somebody else take that part.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right about everything you're saying, Rodney. But I also, in terms of how it's changed, it's just become the preeminent for what the culture is, like what American culture is. You can't think about American culture and not think about hip hop culture. I think about how you could be watching pretty much any award show and a rapper will pop up. You could be watching the Super Bowl and T-Mobile is gonna spend 10 mil on Cardi B. I can't even think of another artist and another, not Taylor Swift. I mean, maybe they work for Taylor Swift. Maybe that's not applicable. But I'm just saying, in film, in TV, in fashion, in fine arts, in sciences, in literature, like hip hop is just a staple that it's too big to feel like you don't need to engage with it. To Rodney's point, talking about how the Grammys have totally taken something that was like shelved off to the side and put it on the main event, even for like the live broadcast. Like we were talking about this because the Grammys are coming up this Sunday, and how a lot of the categories that were not televised, like best rap song performance, well, if they're awarding Drake, who y'all know, Drake, best rap song performance, you better believe that's about to be prime time, because it's like there's no, you can't escape it. Hip hop culture is dominant culture. It's like synonymous with American culture. It's gone all around the world. We argue that it's America's biggest, most influential export, and I think it's only gonna get bigger. And I feel like as it's gotten bigger, more of the people who were the creators in the culture are raising in prominence to where they're having like as much power as just being on the side of the creator. Because from the outside looking in, it's always like the person in front of the camera has the most power. But I think about a really good, it was like an Inside the Actor's Studio with the cast of some show, like Grey's Anatomy or something. And one of the actors said, actually, being an actor is actually one of the most powerless things you can be a lot of times, because you're getting all the shine because you're in front of the camera, but you are literally like a puppet for other people to consume and to debate about, and to absolutely love or cancel, at a moment's notice. And I feel like in hip hop, in music, especially in music that is based on soul, like authenticity, rappers have more of a prerogative and more authority in creating their story in front of the camera. But I just love that there's more people going like behind the camera, behind the boardroom doors, and wielding power in a way that speaks to the vision and to the future of the culture, and speaks to a way that is I think Solitaire said it, like curating the culture in a way that continues to respect it, in a way that is trying to preserve it for decades and decades on. It's funny because it's like it's one of like our youngest genres in terms of it, but it's only it's jumped in like hyperspeed in terms of influence, in terms of marketability, in terms of profitability, and I think it's gonna just continue to do that.
I agree. Great points. I think for me, what I would highlight, the biggest change I think was, coming up in the era that I came up in versus now, there's a lack of this curation. There's a lack of, remember the A&R? Remember when there used to be A&Rs that actually scouted for undiscovered talent, and this undiscovered talent didn't have to sell. They didn't have to have 1 million streams yet. They didn't have to have an audience. They just had to have something unique that they brought to the table as artists. And I think, you know, I personally witnessed the shift of A&Rs going to like, I mean, it still happens, but more so you have an opportunity. If you are somebody who has 1 million streams, it almost doesn't matter what your sound is. You just have a following, and a label will be interested just because you bring an audience that could potentially, that they could capitalize on. So I think that has diluted, I think, a lot of, you know, the cream rising to the top. It's not necessarily the cream anymore. It's just the more popular. And I think that's taken away from the potency of the talent level versus when we were coming up. Like, it wasn't as much driven about, you know, what you had done before. It was a lot more emphasis on the artistry. Not to say, you know, one thing I will say is I think there's less rappers. You know, talking from the Toronto perspective, there was a lot less rappers, but I think ratio wise, there's probably just as much crap back then as there is now, ratio wise. So I think it's important to kind of highlight that too. I don't, you know, I'm not an OG that talks about like, yo, these young rappers are trash. It's like, no, there's dope shit now, just like there was back then. There's just more shit now because of, you know, the sheer numbers of it, access, the accessibility of, you know, digital production software and like creating your own recording studio. I tell artists all the time, like, you have $500, you can have a mixtape out tomorrow if you're diligent enough. And I think that kind of has crowded the market and made it a lot more appetizing to kind of just find the path of least resistance rather than trying to challenge the status quo by bringing something new to the table.
Yeah, for sure. Considering the time, I did want to get the last question, but I think I'm going to have to pass it over to Marco just to wrap up the event, just because I don't want to go over time here. But I want to say thank you to all our panelists. It was great asking you questions. It was great learning from you all. And yeah, over to Marco.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think we'll look to close the Hip Hop Cafe today. There's obviously so much here that we can't get to in an hour and a half, but we're really blessed to have had you all take us to those different connections. I mean, hip hop is just so multifaceted, culturally, musically, and from socio-political perspectives. So just, you know, thank you so much to everyone. I just wanted to share a quick slide. Yeah, just to encourage everybody to learn more about our guests and their respective work, and checking them out online. So yeah, everyone's got their IG on. Rodney, I appreciate you for not having an IG. I just got on it last year at some point. I got a dog and made an account for him and was like, oh, why not? But I appreciate that you don't have one, because I was there for a long time. So anyways, there's a bunch of social handles. Check us out at harthouse.ca, Harthouse Hip Hop Education, obviously Forgiveness Project, FU Project, and Louder Than a Riot, coming from Rodney and Sidney at NPR. That's really it. We're just blessed to have had you all here. Thanks everyone for joining, for your thoughtful questions.